You know, usually when we think about money, we treat it as this immutable law of nature.
Right, like gravity or something.
Exactly. Like you hold a dollar or a euro or a yen and it feels like a physical constant.
Yeah.
You hand it over, you receive a proportional amount of goods or services, and the transaction is complete.
It feels incredibly solid.
Yeah, almost geological in its permanence. But when you actually peel back the layers of global finance, you realize that solid ground just, well, it doesn't exist.
No, it really doesn't.
You aren't standing on bedrock at all. You are standing on this invisible, highly contested architecture that was entirely artificially constructed.
It's basically the ultimate shared illusion, you know? The
Mm.
global financial system is not some product of natural evolution. It is a meticulously engineered mechanism.
Yeah.
And like any engineered system, it was designed by specific people at a specific time to solve very specific problems. The issue, of course, is that the problems of the past rarely map perfectly onto the future.
Right. And that engineered mechanism is exactly what we're focusing on today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Our mission today, for you listening, is to completely demystify the Bretton Woods system. Now, if you follow global economics even a little bit, you hear Bretton Woods thrown around constantly, right?
Oh, all the time. In discussions about trade deficits or currency valuation, American financial hegemony, it's everywhere.
It really is the invisible architecture of the modern global economy.
Yeah.
I mean, it fundamentally shapes the value of the money in your pocket right now, the price of the coffee you bought this morning, the reasons supply chains operate the way they do.
Yeah, absolutely everything.
So we are going to explore the origins, the specific operational mechanics, and the spectacular and honestly inevitable collapse of this system.
And it is quite a story.
It is. It's a history that features a completely paralyzed global economy, a bitter intellectual showdown between empires in a New Hampshire hotel.
Which is such a wild setting for it.
Right. And it has this fatal mathematical paradox called Triffin's dilemma. And finally, an American president deciding to just unilaterally upend the entire global order.
The stakes here really cannot be overstated. We are talking about the structural foundation of the mid-20th century.
Yeah.
Even though the original system of fixed exchange rates formally collapsed in the 1970s, the institutions it birthed and the dollar-centric reality it engineered, they still completely dominate global finance today.
Exactly.
To understand why the US dollar remains the world's reserve currency, or why international monetary policy functions the way it does, you really have to understand the architecture built in 1944.
But to understand 1944, we first have to understand the absolute chaos that necessitated it, right? Because the architects of Bretton Woods didn't just decide to redesign the world on a whim.
No, not at all. They were reacting to extreme trauma.
The system was born out of the catastrophic economic failures of the 1920s and 30s. If we look at the post-World War I landscape, the Treaty of Versailles essentially set up a financial doomsday machine.
That's a good way to put it.
The entire global economy was locked into this toxic, unworkable debt cycle.
And the mechanics of that debt cycle are crucial to grasp because they really highlight the danger of systemic intransigence, you know?
Yeah, lay that out for us.
So you had a situation where Britain owed massive wartime debts to the United States. During the war, Britain had essentially acted as the financier for the other allies, like France and Italy, right?
Right, they were bankrolling them.
Exactly. And they were borrowing heavily from the U.S. to do so. So after the war, the U.S. demands repayment. But the Allies couldn't pay Britain, which meant Britain couldn't pay the U.S.
And the geopolitical solution, quote unquote, was to extract it all from the defeated party.
Naturally.
Right? They expected Germany, a nation whose economy was utterly decimated at that point, to somehow generate the massive capital surpluses required to pay reparations to France and Britain.
Who would then funnel that capital right back to the United States.
Which is mathematically impossible, right?
Yeah, completely impossible. The demands on Germany were totally detached from any economic reality. The result was a massive accumulation of what we would now call non-performing loans.
Just toxic debt sitting there?
Yeah, the assets sitting on the balance sheets of international banks were largely unrecoverable. Creditor nations, particularly the U.S., they refused to forgive the debts while simultaneously raising tariffs.
Oh, right. So Europe couldn't even export to the U.S. to earn the dollars they needed.
Exactly. It made it impossible for European nations to earn dollars through trade. This total breakdown in international cooperation directly fueled the 1931 global banking crisis. The entire credit structure of the international economy just seized up.
Right, and when the credit system seizes, the depression hits, and basic state survival instincts take over. The source material outlines this phenomenon of beggar-thy-neighbor policies.
Yes, and competitive devaluations.
Yeah, instead of coordinating a response, nations basically attempted to export their unemployment. So government would deliberately devalue its own currency against gold. And by making their currency cheaper, their exports became cheaper and more competitive on the global market, while foreign imports became prohibitively expensive for their own citizens.
But the strategy is inherently self-defeating. I mean, if country A devalues its currency to gain a trade advantage, country B instantly loses market share and experiences domestic deflation.
So they just hit back.
Exactly. Country B responds by devaluing its currency even further. It triggers this massive race to the bottom. But what makes this era so devastating wasn't just the devaluations themselves, but the total fragmentation of global trade.
Right, the blocks.
Yes, we saw the rise of autarkic protectionist trade blocs. The global market completely fractured into isolated, walled-off economic zones.
And the British sterling area is a perfect example of this, right?
It is.
Because Britain was running a significant trade deficit, so to maintain their balance of payments, they essentially weaponized their empire.
Yeah, they really did.
They established a system where the wealth generated across the British Empire, like resources from India, gold from South Africa, it all had to be parked in London banks and denominated in pound sterling. They locked their colonies and dominions into a closed economic loop just to artificially prop up their domestic economy.
And you see a much darker, much more aggressive iteration of this with Nazi Germany in the 1930s.
Yeah, absolutely.
Germany created a forced bilateral trading bloc. If a smaller European trading partner ran a surplus with Germany, the German government blocked them from converting that surplus into gold or a usable international currency.
Wow. So what did they do with it?
They forced that nation to spend its surplus exclusively on German-manufactured goods. It was a localized, completely coercive economic system designed to feed the German war machine while insulating it from global financial markets.
So the global trade system essentially ceased to exist as a unified entity.
It was gone.
But there's a deeper structural issue here regarding the gold standard itself, When we look at Ben Bernanke's analysis of the Great Depression, he specifically points to the pre-war international gold standard as the primary transmission mechanism for this economic collapse.
Yes, the hardware itself was flawed.
Right. It wasn't just that politicians were making bad choices. The actual hardware of the international monetary system was forcing a global contraction.
Bernanke's analysis centers on the asymmetry of the gold standard's rules. In theory, under a classical gold standard, if a country is running a trade surplus, gold flows into their central bank.
Okay, makes sense.
This increases their money supply, which raises domestic prices, making their exports less competitive until trade eventually balances out.
Right.
Conversely, the country losing gold experiences deflation, making their exports cheaper until they recover. That's the self-correcting theory.
But that's not what actually happened, right? The surplus countries, specifically the United States and France, they short-circuited the mechanism.
Exactly. The U.S. and France engaged in the massive sterilization of gold inflows.
Sterilization.
Yeah, when gold flowed into their central banks, they didn't allow the domestic money supply to expand. They actively neutralized it, typically by selling domestic securities to soak up the excess currency.
Oh,
They hoarded the gold without allowing the corresponding inflation. Because there is a finite amount of monetary gold in the world, the U.S. and France vacuuming it up and sterilizing it meant the rest of the world was starved of reserves.
So the nations losing gold were forced to aggressively contract their money supplies just to maintain their gold pegs.
Right.
Less money circulating in those economies meant collapsing prices, plummeting industrial output, and skyrocketing unemployment. Bernanke calls this the deflationary vortex.
And the only way countries could escape this vortex was to unilaterally abandon the gold standard.
Which some did, right.
Yeah, the nations that dropped the gold peg early, like Britain did in 1931, they began recovering much faster than those who stubbornly held onto it, like France and the U.S., who suffered through the contraction much longer.
That's fascinating.
The critical lesson internalized by the economists observing this was that a rigid, unmanaged commodity standard combined with uncoordinated national policies is basically a recipe for global economic suicide.
It really highlights a fundamental problem of incentives. Like, imagine you are on a sinking ship, right?
Okay.
And every passenger is frantically trying to patch the hole in their own cabin. But the only way they could do it is by ripping the wooden planks off their neighbor's cabin.
Right, which just creates another hole.
Exactly. Eventually, the whole ship goes down even faster.
Huh.
Global central bankers understood that competitive devaluations and gold sterilization were destroying the macroeconomy. But in the absence of a supranational institution to enforce cooperation, no single central bank could afford to be the first one to stop.
Right, because if you maintain your currency value while your trading partners devalue, your export sector is absolutely decimated.
Right, it's a classic prisoner's dilemma. But I have to push back a little here. If everyone knew these competitive devaluations were destroying global trade, why didn't they just stop and cooperate? I mean, surely they saw the bigger picture.
You would think so. But without a neutral referee and an established rule book, international economic trust is just impossible. In a crisis, nations will default to self-preservation, even if it ensures mutual destruction down the line.
Yet just imagine trying to run a business today. If the value of your money swung wildly every single week because some foreign government arbitrarily changed their currency value.
It would be a nightmare.
That was the 1930s. And this directly sets the stage for the ideological shift that led to Bretton Woods. By the early 1940s, with the Second World War raging, the Allied powers understood that establishing a lasting military peace would be completely impossible without first establishing economic peace.
Yes, the trauma of the 1930s proved that economic warfare inevitably precedes actual warfare.
Right. And the foundational text for this shift is the Atlantic Charter, which was drafted in 1941 during a secret meeting between FDR and Winston Churchill.
Such a pivotal moment.
While it was primarily a statement of war aims, it explicitly called for equal access to trade and raw materials and global economic collaboration. This was heavily influenced by U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull.
Yes, Hull held a deep, almost axiomatic belief in this concept of economic security.
Hull's philosophy is so interesting because it treats economics as the ultimate root cause of geopolitical conflict.
Right.
His perspective was that unhampered trade dovetails with peace, while high tariffs, trade barriers, and discriminatory economic blocs, well, they breed war.
It makes a lot of sense when you look at the sequence of events.
Exactly. If you integrate economies, raise living standards globally, and allow nations to trade freely, you remove the material desperation that drives populations toward radicalism and conflict.
It was a direct repudiation of those autarkic blocs of the 1930s we talked about. The Anglican vision was a massive, open, multilateral trading system.
But recognizing the goal and actually engineering the system to achieve it are two very different things.
Very different.
Which brings us to July 1944. The Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Delegates from 44 allied nations gathered to design the post-war financial order.
But despite the sheer number of nations present, the conference was essentially a two-man intellectual battle.
John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, two brilliant economists representing two empires on entirely different trajectories.
Talk about a clash of titans.
Really, though, Keynes is representing the United Kingdom, an empire heavily battered by the war, drowning in debt, and facing a massive loss of global influence.
Right.
White is representing the United States, an industrial juggernaut whose mainland was untouched by the conflict, holding the vast majority of the world's wealth. And their respective plans for the new global economy perfectly reflected their national interests.
The contrast between the Keynes plan and the White plan represents one of the most significant economic debates of the entire 20th century. Keynes, being acutely aware of Britain's fragile position and those horrors of the 1930s deflationary vortex, wanted a highly elastic pro-growth system.
Yeah.
He proposed the creation of a global central bank, which he called the International Clearing Union.
And the centerpiece of Keynes' clearing union was a new supranational reserve currency called the banker.
Yes. The banker wouldn't be tied to any single nation's domestic monetary policy. It would act as a neutral unit of account for international trade.
Which sounds pretty fair on the surface.
It does. But the truly revolutionary and really controversial aspect of Keynes' plan was how it handled trade imbalances. Keynes believed that the burden of maintaining global financial equilibrium should not fall solely on debtor nations.
Okay.
He proposed a mechanism where if a country was running a massive trade surplus, meaning they were exporting far more than they were importing, they would be penalized.
He literally wanted to charge them interest on their positive balances. Like, if you accumulated too much bancor, The clearing union would essentially tax you,
Exactly.
forcing you to either increase your imports from debtor nations, invest in foreign infrastructure, or just outright donate the surplus.
It was a use-it-or-lose-it system.
Right. Designed to force liquidity back into the global economy and prevent the kind of gold hoarding the U.S. and France engaged in during the 1920s. It's like, imagine you're at a dinner party,
Okay, I like a dinner party.
and the wealthiest guest is forced to pay for the poorest guest's meals just so everyone can keep eating together at the same table.
That's a great analogy. It was a mathematically elegant solution to the problem of hoarding, but it was politically dead on arrival for the Americans.
Oh, I'm sure.
Harry Dexter White, representing the U.S. Treasury, understood that the United States was about to emerge from the war as the world's absolute supreme creditor nation. There was zero political appetite in Washington to join a global system that would proactively tax American export success to subsidize European reconstruction.
So what was White's counterproposal?
Well, White's plan was vastly more conservative and heavily weighted toward American interests. Instead of a global central bank creating limitless banker, White proposed a stabilization fund.
Okay.
This fund would be seeded with a finite pool of national currencies and physical gold contributed by the member states. Under White's model, the burden of adjustment remained firmly on the debtor nations.
Right.
If a country was running a deficit and its currency was under pressure, it could borrow from the stabilization fund to intervene in the markets, but it would have to implement domestic austerity to fix its own balance of payments.
So no penalties for the rich guys.
Exactly. There would be no mandated penalties on creditor nations. And most importantly, White vehemently opposed the banker. He intended for the United States dollar, backed by the immense U.S. gold reserves, to be the undisputed center of the new system.
And because the United States held roughly 2/3 of the world's monetary gold at the time, and was really the only major industrial power capable of providing the capital necessary for post-war reconstruction, well, White possessed all the leverage.
All of it.
Keynes might have had the more innovative macroeconomic theory regarding global equilibrium, but White had the financial brute force.
Yeah, that's exactly what it came down to.
The final agreement at Bretton Woods was overwhelmingly a victory for the White plan. The British essentially had to capitulate because they desperately needed American loans just to survive the immediate post-war period.
The power dynamic was unmistakable. A senior official at the Bank of England later described the Bretton Woods Agreement as the greatest blow to Britain next to the war.
Wow, next to the war.
Because it formalized the absolute transfer of global financial hegemony from London to Washington.
That is wild. Now, it is essential to maintain our historical objectivity here. We should acknowledge that the Soviet Union also attended the Bretton Woods Conference, right?
They did.
They participated in the negotiations and actually secured a relatively large proposed quota in the new institutions. However, they ultimately refused to ratify the agreement.
Yes.
The Soviet leadership calculated that the newly created institutions were heavily skewed toward capitalist interests. They famously characterized them as branches of Wall Street designed to enforce American economic dominance.
And from a structural perspective, the Soviet assessment recognized the reality of the leverage we just discussed. The system was basically designed by and for the primary creditor.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to Keynes. While Keynes lost the political battle at Bretton Woods, economic historians like Brad DeLong have frequently pointed out that Keynes was largely vindicated by history.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, on almost every major point of contention, the need for massive, elastic global liquidity, the dangers of placing the entire burden of adjustment on debtor nations, and the inherent instability of tying the global system to a single sovereign currency, Keynes's warnings eventually materialized.
Right, which makes me wonder, did the U.S. accidentally sabotage the long-term health of the system just to solidify its own dominance in the short term?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question.
Yeah.
By rejecting the bank war and placing the U.S. dollar at the absolute center of the global architecture, the United States optimized the system for its own immediate post-war economic and geopolitical dominance.
Yeah.
But in doing so, they baked a fatal structural paradox into the very foundation of the system.
Right. We will definitely get to that paradox shortly. But first, we really need to examine the actual mechanics of what they built. Like, how did this new world order operate on a day-to-day basis?
The cornerstone of the Bretton Woods system was the fixed exchange rate mechanism, specifically the peg.
The peg.
Yes. The United States made a unilateral commitment to peg the U.S. dollar to physical gold at a fixed price of $35 per troy ounce.
Okay.
To be incredibly precise, the agreement defined the dollar as equal to 13 and 57 grains of gold.
So the U.S. guarantees that any foreign central bank holding dollars can demand physical gold from the U.S. Treasury at that exact rate. The dollar becomes a proxy for gold, literally as good as gold.
Precisely. Once the dollar was anchored to gold, every other member nation was required to peg their national currency to the U.S. dollar. They established a specific par value for their money relative to the dollar.
So if we look at the historical data from the sources, in 1945, the British pound was pegged at $4.03. In 1949, the Japanese yen was pegged at exactly 360 to the dollar. The West German mark was pegged at 4.20. It's basically a hub and spoke system.
Exactly.
Gold is the anchor, the dollar is the heavy chain tied to the anchor, and every other currency in the world is tethered directly to the dollar.
But a tether requires slack, otherwise it snaps under pressure.
Right.
This is where the band comes into play. The architects knew that exchange rates fluctuate daily based on trade flows. So member countries were obligated to maintain their exchange rates within a band of plus or minus 1% of their established parity.
But maintaining that band required active, constant intervention.
It was a ton of work.
Let's look at how that actually works for a second. If you are the Bank of England, and Britain is importing too much, the supply of pounds on the foreign exchange market increases, right? Which drives the value of the pound down toward that 1% lower limit.
Right.
To defend the peg, the Bank of England is legally required to step into the market and buy pounds using their reserves of U.S. dollars or gold.
Yep.
This artificially creates demand for the pound, pushing its value back up toward the center of the band.
And conversely, if a country was exporting heavily and their currency was appreciating toward the upper 1% limit, their central bank had to sell their own domestic currency on the open market and buy up foreign dollars to push the value back down.
That sounds exhausting.
It required central banks to constantly monitor and intervene in the foreign exchange markets. It was a daily operation.
But what happens when the underlying economic reality of a country diverges so far from its peg that intervention is just no longer sustainable? Say a country is suffering massive domestic inflation. Their peg is suddenly wildly overvalued, making their exports totally uncompetitive.
Right. Which happens.
The Bretton Woods System provided a crucial release valve that the rigid gold standard of the 1920s lacked, right?
Yes. That release valve was the concept of fundamental disequilibrium. If a nation found that maintaining its peg was actively destroying its domestic economy, the Bretton Woods Agreement allowed them to adjust their par value by up to 10% without seeking international approval.
Though remarkably, the term fundamental disequilibrium was never actually explicitly defined in the agreement.
No, it wasn't.
Which leaves it open to significant interpretation, doesn't it?
It was intentionally ambiguous to provide political flexibility. But if a country needed to devalue or revalue by more than 10%, they had to formally request permission from the newly established governing body of this entire system.
Which is the International Monetary Fund or the IMF? The IMF, along with the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which we now know as the World Bank, were the two massive institutions created at the conference. These are basically the hardware running the Bretton Woods software.
I like that analogy.
The World Bank was primarily focused on providing long-term capital for the physical reconstruction of war-torn Europe and later economic development projects. But the IMF was the day-to-day manager of the monetary system.
Yes. The IMF functioned as a massive cooperative reserve pool. When the 44 nations established the IMF, they capitalized it with an initial fund of $8.8 billion.
Okay.
Each member nation was assigned a specific quota based on the relative size and strength of its economy.
And the United States obviously had the largest quota, which fundamentally gave them veto power over major IMF decisions, further solidifying American control over the system.
Exactly. When a country joined, they had to pay their quota subscription into the fund. The rules dictated that 25% of the quota had to be paid in gold or U.S. dollars, and the remaining 75% was paid in the country's own local currency.
So you have this central pool holding a massive variety of global currencies alongside a bedrock of gold and dollars.
Right.
It's kind of like an international credit union, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Everyone deposits a bit of gold in their own currency, and if you have a bad year, meaning you are running out of dollar reserves to intervene in the market and defend your 1% band debtor, you don't have to immediately resort to devastating domestic austerity or competitive devaluation.
Exactly.
You can just go to the IMF and purchase the foreign currency you need using your own local currency.
They were essentially borrowing foreign exchange from the collective pool with the agreement that they would repurchase their own currency back from the IMF, usually within 3 to 5 years, using gold or convertible currencies once their trade balance stabilized.
Wow.
This short-term liquidity provision was really the genius of Bretton Woods. It provided the breathing room necessary to maintain fixed exchange rates without forcing nations into the deflationary spirals of the interwar period.
But there is a massive caveat to this entire design. For a system of fixed exchange rates to function, the designers understood they had to drastically limit international capital mobility.
Yes, this is a foundational insight detailed by economic historian Barry Eichengreen. You cannot maintain a fixed exchange rate if massive, unregulated pools of speculative capital are free to flood across borders.
Why not?
Well, if international investors believe a currency is overvalued, they will aggressively short it, moving billions of dollars out of the country in a matter of days. No central bank has enough foreign reserves to defend a 1% peg against a massive, coordinated speculative attack.
So if the money can move instantly, the peg is impossible to defend.
Precisely. Therefore, the Bretton Woods architecture relied on strict capital controls. The system was designed to facilitate trade in goods and services, what we call the current account, while heavily restricting the movement of financial capital.
Okay.
International investment was largely restricted to foreign direct investment, like an American company physically building an automobile factory in France.
Right.
It was not meant to accommodate the frictionless, high-speed bond trading or currency speculation we see today. The fixed rates were only viable because governments kept the capital markets localized and tightly regulated.
And for a brief period, this carefully engineered machine seemed ready to usher in a new era. But almost immediately upon launch, it hit a catastrophic roadblock.
It did.
The system was theoretically sound, but the actual physical reality of the post-war global economy just couldn't support it.
Right. We move into the late 1940s, the IMF is established, the pegs are set, but Europe is literally in ruins.
Yeah, completely devastated.
Their industrial capacity is decimated. Their agricultural output is severely compromised. They desperately need to import food, machinery, and raw materials to rebuild. And the only economy capable of supplying those goods is the United States.
But international trade requires international currency. European nations needed U.S. dollars to buy American exports. However, because their economies were devastated, they had virtually nothing to export back to the United States to earn those dollars.
Right.
Furthermore, they had drained their gold reserves fighting the war. So this created a paralyzing structural crisis known as the dollar shortage.
Yes, the famous dollar shortage.
The entire Bretton Woods mechanism was choking on a lack of liquidity. The United States was running massive structural trade surpluses, hoarding the very currency the rest of the world needed to participate in the global economy.
And if Europe couldn't buy American goods, European reconstruction would fail.
Exactly. And the U.S. economy would likely slip back into a post-war depression due to lack of export demand.
The U.S. government recognized that the only way to save the global capitalist system and frankly, to prevent the economically devastated Western European nations from falling into the Soviet sphere of influence, was to artificially inject massive amounts of dollar liquidity into the global market.
They had to basically push the dollars out.
They had to systematically run a financial account deficit to offset their current account surplus.
And the primary vehicle for this massive liquidity injection was the European Recovery Program, universally known as the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1954, the United States provided approximately $17 billion in economic assistance to 16 Western European countries. And crucially, the vast majority of this assistance was not in the form of loans that would recreate the World War I debt trap.
No, they were outright grants.
Outright grants.
The Marshall Plan, alongside the military expenditures of the Truman Doctrine, basically functioned as a colossal recycling mechanism.
How so?
The U.S. government gave dollars to European governments, who then immediately used those dollars to purchase American manufactured goods, agricultural products, and heavy machinery.
Oh, I see.
It's solved the dollar shortage, capitalized the European rebuilding effort, and sustained American industrial output all at once.
And from a macroeconomic perspective, it was an astounding success. By the late 1950s, European and Japanese industrial competitiveness had recovered. Trade barriers were being lowered through agreements like JDT. The fixed exchange rates provided a stable, predictable environment for international commerce. We enter what economic historians refer to as the golden age of capitalism.
It really was an era of unprecedented, sustained global growth and rising living standards, deeply intertwined with the geopolitical reality of Pax Americana. The system appeared to be functioning exactly as Harry Dexter White envisioned.
Yeah.
The U.S. dollar was the undisputed center of global trade, and the world economy was thriving. But hiding deep within the mathematics of this success was a structural contradiction that would ultimately destroy the system.
And this brings us to the fatal paradox, identified in 1960 by the Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin. It is known as Triffin's dilemma, and it is arguably one of the most elegant and terrifying economic concepts of the 20th century.
It really is. Triffin's dilemma perfectly articulates the inherent instability of using a single sovereign currency as the global reserve asset.
Walk us through it.
Triffin observed two intersecting contradictory realities. First, as the global economy rapidly expanded during the 1950s and 60s, the volume of international trade increased exponentially. To facilitate that trade, the world needed a constantly expanding supply of international liquidity, specifically U.S. dollars.
So for central banks around the world to maintain their reserves and manage their pegs, they needed to hold more and more dollars.
Exactly. And the only way for the rest of the world to accumulate those dollars was for the United States to continually supply them. The U.S. had to run persistent structural balance of payments deficits.
Right.
They had to continually push more money out into the global system through military spending, foreign aid, and eventually a trade deficit.
So to satisfy the global demand for liquidity, the U.S. has to print and export an ever-increasing mountain of paper dollars. But here's the mechanism that triggers the dilemma. The foundational promise of the entire Bretton Woods system was the peg. Every single one of those offshore dollars was theoretically convertible into physical gold at the U.S. Treasury at the immutable rate of $35 an ounce.
And that is exactly where the math breaks down. The global supply of paper dollars was expanding exponentially to fuel the post-war economic boom. But the physical supply of gold held by the United States in Fort Knox was not expanding.
It was finite.
It was finite. Triffin realized that as the ratio of outstanding paper dollars to physical gold reserves deteriorated, it would inevitably erode the confidence of foreign governments.
Right.
Eventually, foreign central banks would look at the balance sheets, realize that the U.S. outstanding dollar liabilities far exceeded their gold assets, and they would panic.
That's like a bartender at a massive party.
Okay, another analogy.
Hear me out. To keep the party going and keep everyone happy, the bartender, who is the U.S. in this case, has to hand out free IOUs for drinks. But eventually, the guests look around and realize there are way more IOUs floating around than actual alcohol in the bar.
Right, and panic sets in.
Exactly. It is a brilliant, tragic paradox.
Right.
The system demands that the United States provide the liquidity for global growth. But the act of providing that liquidity mathematically guarantees that the U.S. will eventually be unable to honor the gold peg that gives the liquidity its value in the first place.
You are forced to choose between starving the global economy of capital or destroying the confidence in the currency. You simply cannot have both.
So the system was mathematically doomed from the start. Was it a feature or a bug that the planners in 1944 just didn't foresee?
When Harry Dexter White designed the system in 1944, the United States held nearly 65% of the world's monetary gold. The idea that they could ever face a crisis of confidence regarding their gold reserves seemed absurd at the time.
They just couldn't imagine it.
Right. The planners assumed that global gold production would increase sufficiently to match the growth in world trade, but they profoundly underestimated the velocity of post-war economic expansion. By the early 1960s, Triffin's theoretical dilemma was manifesting as a very real, very dangerous geopolitical crisis.
It's a masterclass in unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Solving today's problem, the lack of liquidity, creates tomorrow's crisis, the lack of confidence.
Exactly.
So as we move into the 1960s, the contradictions begin to tear the system apart from multiple angles. We see a massive shift in the structural realities that previously allowed Bretton Woods to function. One of the most significant shifts was the collapse of the capital controls that Barry Eichengreen emphasized were so crucial. And this collapse was driven by the rise of the eurodollar market.
The mechanics of the eurodollar market are absolutely fascinating because they illustrate how capital inherently seeks to route around regulation.
How does this work?
A eurodollar is simply a U.S. dollar-denominated deposit held in a bank outside the United States, originally in London. Because these deposits were held outside U.S. borders, they fell completely outside the regulatory jurisdiction of the Federal Reserve.
Wow. So no rules.
Right. They were not subject to U.S. reserve requirements or interest rate caps.
And the origins of this market are deeply tied to the Cold War. The Soviet Union, the same nation that rejected the Bretton Woods institutions, was heavily involved in international commodities trade and earned substantial U.S. dollars.
Yes.
But during the 1950s, the Soviets were terrified that if they held their dollar reserves in New York banks, the U.S. government could freeze or confiscate their assets during a geopolitical dispute.
Which is a valid fear.
Right. So they began depositing their dollars in European banks, primarily in London.
And the London banks realized they suddenly had access to a massive pool of unregulated U.S. dollars. They began lending these dollars out to international corporations and other governments. This created a parallel offshore dollar economy.
And the euro-dollar market just exploded.
It did. It grew from practically zero in the late 1950s to an estimated $80 billion by 1972.
That's insane.
This vast, unregulated pool of hot money completely undermined the capital controls that Bretton Woods relied upon. Billions of dollars could now flow across borders instantly, overwhelming the ability of central banks to defend their 1% pegs.
Simultaneously, the geopolitical and economic supremacy of the United States was shifting. By the late 1960s, Europe and Japan were not just recovered, they were highly competitive export powerhouses.
Yes.
The U.S. was no longer the sole supplier of manufactured goods to the world, and yet the global system still required them to act as the sole provider of liquidity.
This external pressure was exponentially compounded by disastrous U.S. domestic policy. The 1960s marked the escalation of the Vietnam War and the implementation of Lyndon B. Johnson's expansive Great Society domestic social programs.
Right.
The U.S. government was committing to astronomical expenditures on two fronts simultaneously: a massive overseas military conflict and the largest expansion of the domestic welfare state since the New Deal.
And crucially, the Johnson administration made the political calculation not to pay for these expenditures through taxation.
Right.
Raising taxes to fund an increasingly unpopular war was politically toxic. So instead, they relied on monetary expansion. The Federal Reserve printed massive amounts of money to absorb the government debt.
This excessive printing fueled rampant domestic inflation within the United States. And because the U.S. was running a structural balance of payments deficit, those inflated, devalued dollars were constantly flowing outward into foreign central banks.
So the rest of the world was essentially importing American inflation. The fixed peg of $35 an ounce became a glaring fiction. The dollar was severely overvalued compared to its actual purchasing power and its deteriorating gold backing.
Foreign governments were sitting on mountains of depreciating paper dollars, watching the U.S. spend recklessly, and Triffin's dilemma fully materialized.
The confidence evaporated.
Why hold a depreciating paper asset when you were legally entitled to exchange it for physical gold at a guaranteed, artificially low price? The run on the bank began.
Right. The initial attempt to stop the bleeding was a collective effort. In 1961, the U.S. and 7 European allies established the London Gold Pool. Because there was a free market for gold in London, alongside the official central bank rate, the price of gold in the free market began spiking well above $35 an ounce due to private speculation against the dollar.
Yes.
The 8 governments agreed to pool their physical gold reserves and intervene in the London market, actively selling their gold to suppress the free market price and defend the $35 peg.
They were essentially burning their physical gold to maintain the psychological illusion of dollar stability.
Which is wild. But the underlying fundamentals were too skewed. The U.S. continued to print money, inflation worsened, and the speculative pressure became overwhelming. In March 1968, the London free market experienced a massive, unprecedented demand for gold.
Yeah.
The intervention required to suppress the price became so immense that the participating European nations refused to drain their reserves any further to subsidize American deficits. So, the London gold pool collapsed.
Following the collapse of the gold pool, the system bifurcated. They established a 2-tier market, a floating free market price for private transactions, and the official $35 peg strictly maintained for transactions between central banks.
Okay.
But even this central bank solidarity quickly disintegrated. Nations, acting out of rational self-interest, began aggressively cashing out.
France, under Charles de Gaulle, was particularly aggressive about this. De Gaulle had long criticized the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar, arguing that the system allowed the U.S. to force the rest of the world to finance its domestic deficits and its military adventures abroad.
And he wasn't wrong.
It really wasn't. The French government actively demanded physical gold from the U.S. Treasury in exchange for their dollar reserves, physically shipping the bullion across the Atlantic.
The drain on U.S. reserves was staggering. By 1970, the ratio of U.S. gold to its foreign dollar liabilities had deteriorated from over 55% down to a precarious 22%.
Oh, wow.
The U.S. simply did not have the physical bullion to cover the paper claims.
The International Monetary Fund recognized the impending catastrophe and attempted a final, desperate structural reform. In 1967, they introduced special drawing rights, or SDRs.
Ah, yes, SDRs.
The SDR was essentially an artificial synthetic reserve asset, sometimes referred to as paper gold. The idea was to create a new source of international liquidity that wasn't reliant on the U.S. balance of payments deficits or the finite supply of physical gold.
Right.
The IMF would allocate SDRs to member nations to supplement their reserves, hoping this would reduce the pressure on the dollar.
It was an attempt to retroactively implement a version of Keynes' Bancor. But it was far too little, far too late. SDRs constituted a tiny fraction of global reserves, and they failed to restore confidence in the massively overvalued dollar.
So the speculation continued.
Oh, it intensified. In the first 6 months of 1971 alone, over $22 billion in assets fled the United States. By August of 1971, the British government, the most steadfast American ally, formally requested that the U.S. guarantee the gold value of their massive dollar holdings, effectively signaling they were preparing to demand physical redemption.
The system had reached its absolute breaking point. If the U.S. allowed the run on Fort Knox to continue, they would exhaust their remaining gold reserves, destroying their geopolitical standing and sparking a catastrophic global financial panic.
They had to do something.
The Nixon administration realized they had to act decisively. And this brings us to the climax of the Bretton Woods era. The weekend of August 13, 1971. President Richard Nixon convenes a highly secretive meeting of his top economic advisors at Camp David.
Yes.
And the resulting action was a geopolitical earthquake. On the evening of August 15th, Nixon interrupts national television broadcasting to announce Executive Order 11-16-15.
The event universally known as the Nixon shock.
Nixon announced a series of radical unilateral measures. He imposed an immediate 90-day freeze on all wages and prices in the United States to combat domestic inflation. He slacked a 10% surcharge on all imports to immediately improve the U.S. trade balance. But the most consequential decision, the decision that permanently altered human history, was his announcement that he had directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. He unilaterally closed the gold window.
It is difficult to overstate the magnitude of this decision. The U.S. dollar was instantaneously transformed into a pure fiat currency. Its value was no longer derived from a fixed weight of physical metal, but solely from the authority and economic output of the United States government.
And the manner in which this was executed was stunning. Nixon made this decision in total secrecy. He did not consult the IMF. He did not consult the leaders of the other 43 nations that signed the Bretton Woods Agreement.
He didn't even consult his own State Department.
It was just crazy.
He knew they would vehemently object to the diplomatic fallout. He essentially blew up the foundational pillar of the global economic architecture without warning.
So when Nixon closed the gold window, turning the dollar into a fiat currency, did the U.S. essentially default on its Bretton Woods obligations to the rest of the world?
Yes. From a legal and diplomatic standpoint, the United States unilaterally abrogated an international treaty. The core promise of Bretton Woods, the anchor that convinced the world to accept dollar hegemony in 1944, was that the dollar was as good as gold. Nixon defaulted on that promise. Neoclassical economists often point to August 15, 1971, as the exact moment when the world fundamentally lost faith in the United States' ability or willingness to responsibly manage its structural deficits.
It's like playing a high-stakes poker game, right? You realize you don't have the chips to cover your bets, so you just decide to flip the table over and declare the chips are now worth whatever you say they are.
That's a very accurate description. The immediate aftermath was absolute chaos in the foreign exchange markets. The anchors had been cut. Following the shock, there was a frantic, desperate attempt by the major powers to take the broken system back together.
Yeah.
In December 1971, the group of 10, the wealthiest industrialized nations, met and signed the Smithsonian Agreement.
The Smithsonian Agreement was an attempt to establish a modified, devalued peg, right?
Yes.
The U.S. officially devalued the dollar against gold, shifting the official price from $35 to $38 an ounce. Furthermore, they agreed to widen the intervention bands from the tight 1% margin to a more flexible 2.25%.
Right.
President Nixon enthusiastically heralded it as the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world.
He had a way with words. But the fundamentals hadn't changed. The U.S. was still running massive deficits, and the underlying imbalances were too severe for even a widened band to contain.
Yeah.
The source material notes that almost immediately after signing the Smithsonian Agreement, the Federal Reserve under Arthur Burns actively lowered domestic interest rates to stimulate the U.S. economy ahead of the 1972 election.
Oh, no.
This caused even more capital to flee the U.S. in search of higher yields abroad, massively intensifying the downward pressure on the dollar and totally undermining the newly established pegs.
So the Smithsonian Agreement collapsed within 15 months. Speculative attacks against the dollar reached unprecedented levels. In early 1973, facing massive capital inflows that were distorting their own domestic economies, the governments of Japan and the major European Economic Community nations finally capitulated. They abandoned the effort to maintain fixed exchange rates against the dollar and allowed their currencies to float freely against one another, their values determined purely by market supply and demand.
The Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates was officially dead. The reality of floating fiat currencies was later formally recognized and ratified by the IMF at the Jamaica Accords in 1976.
So the hardware of the fixed peg was permanently dismantled.
Yes. Giving birth to the modern multi-trillion-dollar daily foreign exchange market we know today, where currencies are traded continuously based on highly volatile market sentiment.
But while the mechanism of fixed exchange rates died, the legacy of Bretton Woods deeply defined the ensuing decades. The institutions, the IMF and the World Bank survived and expanded their mandates.
They did.
And crucially, despite the severing of the gold link and the collapse of the formal system, the United States dollar maintained its position as the undisputed supreme reserve currency of the global economy.
And this brings us to a critical analysis of that legacy. The source material highlights the concept we touched on earlier, the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar. Because global commodities like oil are priced in dollars, and because foreign central banks still hold the vast majority of their reserves in dollars, the United States experiences a unique structural advantage in the global economy.
The exorbitant privilege means the United States can run massive, sustained trade and fiscal deficits with far fewer immediate consequences than any other sovereign nation, right?
Exactly.
When the U.S. runs a deficit, it essentially pays for it by printing dollars. Because the rest of the world needs those dollars for international trade, they absorb the debt. It allows the U.S. to consume more than it produces, effectively borrowing from the rest of the world at structurally suppressed interest rates.
It locks in a global financial hierarchy where American domestic monetary policy, the decisions made by the Federal Reserve regarding interest rates, becomes de facto global monetary policy, forcing other nations to adjust their economies to American dictates.
It's like an old operating system. We updated the software in the 70s to floating rates, but the hardware, the World Bank and IMF, is still running 1944 code.
That's incredibly accurate. Furthermore, the institutions themselves have faced intense and sustained criticism over the subsequent decades, particularly from nations in the global south.
Yeah.
The critique focuses on the power dynamics embedded within the IMF and the World Bank. Because voting power is tied to financial quotas, these institutions remain firmly controlled by the wealthy industrialized nations, primarily the U.S. and Western Europe.
The source notes that the IMF is heavily criticized for the conditionality of its loans. When developing nations face balance of payments crises today, the IMF often requires them to implement severe structural adjustment programs in exchange for financial assistance. These programs typically mandate harsh domestic austerity cutting, public spending, privatizing state assets, and deregulating labor markets. Critics argue that these measures prioritize debt repayment to Western financial institutions over local economic stability, frequently exacerbating poverty and severely restricting the ability of developing nations to manage their own economic recovery.
Similarly, the World Bank has faced intense scrutiny regarding the environmental and social impacts of the massive infrastructure projects it funds in developing nations, with critics pointing to a history of displacement and ecological disruption justified under the banner of modernization.
So the fundamental criticism is that the architecture designed at Bretton Woods in 1944 inherently structurally disadvantages developing economies.
Exactly, forcing them to operate within a framework optimized for the capital accumulation of the global north.
Given the structural issues and the criticisms from developing nations, is it even possible to have a truly equitable global financial system, or does someone always have to be the hegemon to keep the peace?
The structural tensions embedded in this legacy have never been resolved. They simply mutate. We continually see the ghosts of Bretton Woods invoked whenever the global financial system fractures. During the devastating 2008 global financial crisis, prominent world leaders, such as French President Nicolas Sarkozy, publicly demanded that we rethink the international monetary system from scratch, explicitly calling for Bretton Woods II.
And we saw it again more recently. In 2020, during the unprecedented economic contraction caused by the global pandemic, the managing director of the IMF explicitly declared a new Bretton Woods moment, calling for massive, coordinated fiscal responses and a rethinking of the global debt architecture.
The language of 1944 is constantly resurrected because the foundational problem, how to balance sovereign national interests with the need for a stable, cooperative, global financial network, remains unsolved.
If we look at the entire sweeping history, the dual legacy of Bretton Woods represents a profound, perhaps unresolvable tension. On one hand, the architects at Mount Washington succeeded in their primary mission.
They really did.
They engineered a system that dragged the world out of the destructive, beggar-thy-neighbor autarky of the 1930s. They capitalized the rebuilding of a devastated European continent. They established a framework that facilitated decades of unprecedented global economic expansion. And in doing so, they arguably provided the economic stability necessary to prevent a Third World War.
But that stability came at an enormous structural cost. It required the installation of a global hegemon. It forced the entire international monetary system to rely on the domestic political choices and the fiscal discipline of a single nation.
Yeah.
And when the domestic priorities of the United States funding a controversial war and expanding domestic spending conflicted with its international obligations, the United States unilaterally shattered the system, plunging the world into a volatile era of fiat currencies while retaining the exorbitant privilege the system had granted it.
It's a remarkable journey. We moved from the deflationary trauma of the 1930s to the grand imperial engineering of the Mount Washington Hotel, through the prosperity of the Golden Age, directly into the mathematical inevitability of Triffin's dilemma, culminating in the shockwaves of August 1971.
And as we navigate the complexities of the 21st century economy with rising inflation, shifting geopolitical power dynamics, and the constant threat of financial instability, the structural flaws and unresolved debates of the Bretton Woods Conference are more relevant than ever.
Which brings us to a final fascinating parallel mentioned in our source material. And this is where I want to leave you, the listener, with something provocative to ponder.
Well, this is a good one.
The text notes a growing contemporary dialogue surrounding decentralized financial systems. Today, we see assets like Bitcoin and broader cryptocurrency networks increasingly suggested as potential alternatives to a financial system dominated by central banks and government-controlled fiat money.
It's a really interesting comparison.
Think back to the debates of 1944. Think back to John Maynard Keynes. Keynes desperately wanted to create the bankeretter, a neutral, supranational unit of account that was not tied to any single country's domestic political agenda, their military spending, or their finite gold reserves.
He recognized the inherent danger of granting one superpower the exorbitant privilege of controlling the world's money.
Right. At Bretton Woods, the world rejected Keynes' vision because the United States possessed the overwhelming leverage to install the dollar instead. But today, as faith in centralized institutions and the stability of fiat currencies wavers in the face of inflation and geopolitical weaponization of the financial system, we have to ask a profound question. Could a decentralized algorithm, operating outside the control of any sovereign state, eventually become the digital manifestation of the bankor that Keynes dreamed of? Could it finally offer a mechanism to free the global economy from the structural imbalances engineered in 1944?
Or, by seeking a hard, unmanipulable limit on currency creation, are we simply rebuilding the rigid deflationary gold standard of the 1920s, complete with all the exact same fatal flaws that destroyed the world economy a century ago?
It is a question that cuts to the very core of what money actually is,
Yeah.
and who we trust to control it. Something to think about the next time you look at the paper money in your wallet or the digital numbers in your bank account, and remember that the solid ground beneath it all is just a fragile, constructed reality. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.